All right, guys, I told you I would do a separate video on just the checks and balances because there are a lot of them and they're pretty important to how the structure of the government works, and we're going to keep coming back to them throughout the year as we go over the individual branches. So the checks and balances is a pretty ingenious system for frustrating politicians. I call this government by pettiness because it very much is. It's little slights that each branch can hold over the other branches before they're able to do their constitutionally obligated task. So, Congress has the power to make law, but the president gets to intervene in that process. Presidents have the power to veto, but Congresses are given the ability to walk around the side of the president if they think something's really important. All the branches have to, rely on the court's ability to interpret the law and how the law is going to be carried out, and also whether that law is even consistent with how the Constitution works. So it is a very petty system. It is sibling rivalry at a governmental scale. The branches are the children of the Constitution, and the Constitution is a parent that likes to watch them, argue with each other. So we'll start with Congress because Article 1 is the first article of the Constitution, and Congress is the most powerful branch, even though sometimes we don't see it that way. So to start, Congress versus the president. Congress can impeach and remove a president. We saw that process play out earlier in the spring, 1,000 years ago, back in February. That the president was impeached by the House. The Senate then conducts the trial of evidence. The senators play jurors. Impeachments are a political process because they have political players involved in them. Your vote on impeachment can't ever really be all that impartial if your reelection is tied to how you vote during an impeachment. So every impeachment in American history has pretty much fallen into party lines. What's really interesting is the impeachment in February was the most bipartisan impeachment of a president ever because one U.S. senator voted to remove the president from office on one of the two charges, which makes it, with that one member of the president's party voting for removal, the most bipartisan impeachment in American history, which tells you just how partisan the process always has been. Congress can override a president's veto by a two-thirds majority vote. So Congress passes a law, it goes through the House, it goes through the Senate, it goes to the president's desk, but the president doesn't like it, so he vetoes the bill and says, this will not become law. Well, Congress really thought that was a good idea. They wanted that law to pass. So they have all-night meetings, they whip up the votes, and by a two-thirds majority, the House passes the bill, and a two-thirds majority, the Senate passes the bill. When the president wakes up the next morning, that bill is a law, even though he didn't sign it. Congress has investigation and oversight authority. Basically, since Congress has the power of the purse, they're the only branch that can spend money. Anything federal money touches, Congress has the authority to provide oversight and investigation of. They do funding and appropriations. Again, they're the only branch that can spend money. And then the Senate does have some special powers when it comes to relating to the president. They have what's called the power of consent. There are certain procedures that the president has to abide by when it comes to nominating certain officials for positions in the federal government, like judges and cabinet members and heads of executive agencies, and when the president negotiates a treaty with a foreign country. Both of those have to go through the United States Senate for approval. So that does give the at least the senators, who are the more elite members of Congress from a constitutional perspective, they have a special relationship with the president in those negotiations. As far as Congress and the courts go, impeachment is a power for all federal appointees, not just the president, but members of the president's cabinet can be impeached and removed by Congress, and federal judges can be impeached and removed by Congress. We've never impeached and removed a judge from the Supreme Court, but there have been about 88 impeachments of federal judges from the lower courts by Congress, and I think about two-thirds of those have actually successfully removed judges from the bench. So it is a power that Congress has over all federal appointments, not just the presidency. Congress gets to control the jurisdiction of the courts. When the Constitution was written, Article 3 was very vague in terms of what the federal court system would look like because they didn't know what the country would look like. So the Supreme Court is established by the Constitution, but all the lower courts are left to Congress to decide. So they get to decide what kinds of cases those lower courts see, and they can create special courts called legislative courts to take cases away from the federal court system. So like tax law is so complicated and complex and requires special judges who understand tax law that the tax courts are a separate court. The military courts, if you're a member of the military and you break military rules that may not apply to all citizens, you go to special military courts that Congress has established. All of the lower courts, so the district courts that every state has at least one district court. There are 94 in total because bigger states have more courts. And then there's the appeals courts, which are a collection of courts that are sometimes called the circuit courts. The circuit courts, because it used to be that the judges actually traveled from state to hear those appeals. Today, the circuit courts are all in centralized locations, and groups of states send their appeals to those specific cities. So Ohio's circuit is actually based in Cincinnati, but that court also hears cases from Kentucky and Tennessee and Michigan because they are all part of the same circuit. There is no rule about how many judges are on each court. The district courts only have one judge. It looks a lot like a trial court. Every episode of Law and Order you've ever seen looked like a district court. Appeals courts are hearings. They're not trials. So it's a 3-panel justice trial or hearing. So there are 3 judges, and the judges debate amongst each other and then decide how they would like to vote. And so sometimes you get unanimous 3-0 decisions. Sometimes you get 2-1 decisions out of the appeals courts. It just depends on the case and the judges that heard it. And then the Supreme Court has traditionally had 9 justices. At some points it's been as many as 10, and sometimes as few as 6. So that number has fluctuated. There's no rule that says it has to be 9. It's just a number we've settled on. And then, of course, Congress gets to consent to the appointment of all federal judges and Supreme Court justices in the Senate. So they do have a say in who ends up being on the courts. As far as the president go, presidents can veto legislative acts. There's 2 different types of vetoes. There's direct vetoes. That's where the president just says, I'm vetoing this. I'm refusing to sign it. And then he walks back into the White House. It's typically how that goes. The second one's what's called a pocket veto, which is kind of a procedural veto. The way it works is the president could leave something on his desk for 10 days undone. Like he just doesn't do anything with it. He just leaves it unsigned. And if he were to do that, the bill would either automatically pass if Congress was still in town and having a session, or it automatically is vetoed if Congress has adjourned for the year. So pocket vetoes can only happen in like very special circumstances. Presidents can call special sessions of Congress. This isn't really an issue today because Congress pretty much works year round. They take a bunch of vacations, but overall they're in session from January to December. But in the past, Congress was a part-time job. You did it about 5 months out of the year, and if a crisis occurred, like a war, an invasion, economic crisis, the president could demand that Congress return to the Capitol and begin working on solving the crisis. Presidents can issue executive orders through their administration, so the president is going to write an executive order that tells a part of the government how to interpret the law. Executive orders are not new laws. They don't carry the weight of new laws, but they do tell the federal government how to behave, which means they look in practice a lot like laws. Now, the big difference here is an executive order can change from president to president. They don't have a lot of long-standing success because the next president could come in and totally undo that executive order. Presidents have what's called executive privilege. Executive privilege is the understanding that presidents need to be able to have confidential conversations with other members of their administration without those conversations then being subpoenaed by Congress for political purposes. So the president is given an allowance of a certain amount of expected secrecy, but the courts have said that secrecy can't be in service of breaking the law. That's actually one of the reasons why Richard Nixon ended up resigning, is he lost a case to keep a secret. And when that secret came out, it was very clear that he had acted illegally. The president himself is not the tiebreaker in the Senate, but the vice president is the president of the Senate, and the vice president gets to cast the tie-breaking vote if there is a tie. As far as the president and the courts, it's pretty straightforward. The president gets to nominate the people who end up on the Supreme Court and in the federal courts. So having the ability to choose who goes there does have the ability to shape what the courts look like and what future decisions might actually end up looking like. As far as the courts go, this is where it gets very easy to keep the checks and balances in mind. The courts have the power of judicial review over actions that the president conducts. So if the president signs an executive order, if the president issues a directive to a member of the executive branch to do something, all of that can be held up by the courts, and the Supreme Court is able to say if the president acted constitutionally or unconstitutionally. It does get kind of tricky for the Supreme Court, though, because the second article of the Constitution is not nearly as explicit as the first. They just don't spell out as many of the specific powers of the president. So presidents do have a little bit more wiggle room in terms of how they use their power and how they define their power. As far as Congress goes, it's the same thing. The courts really they're a one-trick pony. The courts have one major power. It's judicial review. So if Congress passes a law, that law can be reviewed by the Supreme Court, and if the Supreme Court finds that that law went too far, that that law is in direct violation of a part of the Constitution, the Supreme Court is within its rights to strike that law down and render it moot. And that law no longer applies, because that's how judicial review works. And it's very convenient, at least from a AP government student perspective, that for the courts there's one power and it's the same for all the branches. The courts are, they check Congress by using judicial review, and they check the president by using judicial review. So those are the major checks and balances. We'll come back to them as we study the individual branches in more specifics and more detail in the next semester. But for now, it's a good starting point to kind of understand the relationship the branches have to each other and the ways that they can snipe at each other and prevent them from using too much power.